Hey everybody, it's Steve Presser, Director of Adult Discipleship, Grow Coordinator here at Mount Zion. We're in, I believe now, the 5th week of our study here during the Lent season as we're heading closer and closer to Easter weekend. And today we're going to be looking at two thieves on the cross. It's the same story and yet very different perspectives as we come to look at how each of them saw Jesus. And so it's an interesting thing because it reminds me a little bit of just growing up at home. You know, I have an older sister, and we have a lot of similar life experiences when it comes to our parents, let's say. And yet each of us have very different perspectives as to how we view those parents in different situations. So whether it's mom or dad or, you know, how we feel about them given a particular situation, how they handled discipline, let's say, or how they, were they a good cook or not, or, you know, just different various things like that. Each of us, depending on how we see them, their perspectives can be very different, even though we both shared very much the same experience. And we see that with these two men on the cross as well. And so if you have a Bible, you can turn to Luke chapter 23, and we're going to pick the story up in verse 32, because the real question is, you know, what these men each do with Jesus is going to determine their future. Now, they're both on a cross, they're both going to die, but what I'm talking about specifically here is their eternal future. And you and I both have a decision to make as well as we look at and we consider Jesus. So let's take a look at Luke 23, starting here in verse 32. So it picks up in the crucifixion story, two others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by, watching. But the rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription above him that read, "This is the King of the Jews." Now one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." So what we have to start with here is we have two condemned men. You know, the scriptures tell us plainly that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So in reality, everyone who walks the face of this earth are already condemned, spiritually speaking. And what's interesting, too, about these two condemned men is Matthew and Mark's gospel, they call them robbers, not criminals. And the robbers is likened to the idea of an insurrectionist, much like we talked about last week with Barabbas. They likely shared in the violence. They likely shared in the murder, the unrest. And so all of this led them also to be taken to the cross. And if you remember from last week, we talked about how Jesus took the place of Barabbas. You know, in all likelihood, it could be that Barabbas should have been on that middle cross, and instead it was Jesus. Barabbas may very likely have been executed along with his own comrades, as it were. But they initially shared the same perspective. If you look at Matthew 27:44, if you want to go back to that, it actually states there that both of these criminals initially reviled Jesus. And so both of them are taken to the cross with Jesus. They both hurl insults at him and revile him. And then it would seem, as the story goes on in Luke's account, that suddenly there's a change of heart for some reason. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So, but just imagine that. Imagine yourself struggling to breathe on the cross, as you're hanging there suffocating under your own weight, you're struggling to breathe, and yet somehow you're able to muster up the energy to revile Jesus of all people. And perhaps it's out of desperation, because in the mocking, there's also the truth, right? If you're Christ, save yourself and us. There's a plea of desperation, but there's also maybe some sarcasm or some anger in the midst of those kinds of comments. And these men indeed were going to die soon, within several hours. Now, we may not be dying in several hours ourselves. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance you have a good amount of life left. But we are under the same condemnation, in that without Jesus, we are subject to judgment. And we've made a reference to this before, but if you were to go back and look at Romans 5, specifically in verse 18, where it talks about how under one man, Adam, all have sinned, and because all have sinned, all are condemned. But in Jesus, his one act of righteousness has been able to make a way and pay the debt for all, and that's amazing. So you have two condemned men, but you also have two responses to Jesus. So as we said, they both initially revile him, but then one has a change of heart. So in Luke 23 at verse 39, we see the first thief. He says, "If you really are who you say you are you not the Christ?" He said, "Save yourself and us." We do that with Jesus a lot. The conditions of our own heart challenges Jesus. Are you not God? Are you not Jesus? Don't you see my pain? Don't you see my misery? If you are who you say you are, can't you get me out of this mess? And it shows the condition of the human heart. We often like to demand that God prove himself to us on our own terms. And we are the ones who inflict harm on ourselves. And then we have the audacity to go back to God and ask and demand of him to show his worth, to show his value, to show his love, to do what exactly? To rescue us. If you are who you say you are, rescue us. Now, one demands the proof. The other demands faith. Because if I believe that Jesus is who he says he is, I will have faith to believe he will deliver me. The other doesn't have the faith. It demands the proof. If you are who you say you are, then you must do this. And if you don't, I can't believe. Doubting Thomas did that. We talked about that in the first week as well. And so I guess that's a really good question for you is, have you done that? Have you voiced to God, if you really are who you say you are, if you really exist, Lord, can't you fix this? Can't you change that? Can't you relieve me of this? But the second man, he has a change of heart. And so maybe, as we think about his perspective, maybe he had a change of heart because he heard Jesus, as we read about. He prayed for forgiveness. Maybe he heard all of the pleas of Jesus while he was on the cross. We did a study a while back on all the different sayings of Jesus. This was last Easter, I believe, but it's here on our YouTube channel, of all the different sayings of Christ. And so maybe he heard Jesus speak to Mary there that day and John. Maybe he heard Jesus, as we talked about, offer up forgiveness. Maybe he heard Jesus reciting Psalm 22 or some other passage. If you go back and read Psalm 22, you're going to see at least 3 references of the sayings of Jesus that are referenced specifically in that psalm. And it's a conviction I hold that I really do wonder or believe if Jesus was reciting that entire psalm as a prayer on the cross. The last thing he says, of course, is, "So be it," or tetelestai, which is at the very end of Psalm 22, in addition to my God, why have you forsaken me?" which is in the beginning, and the fact that he thirsts on the cross. But maybe this criminal also is likely a Jew. And if so, maybe his eyes were opened to the fact that, wait a minute, didn't Isaiah talk about this suffering servant, this lamb who would be slain, who would take on all of our iniquity, and that he would be pierced and striped? And maybe all of it's coming together just in the nick of time for this criminal. But whatever it is, the man was able at this point to see Jesus for who he really is. And he was able to see Jesus not just as a man, but he was able to see him truly as both the King of the Jews as well as the Savior of the world. And that's amazing. He told his friend in verse 40 through 41, "Don't you fear God? This man did nothing wrong." His prayer is so simple that he gives to Jesus. It's just another plea. He says, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And so I want to just give you 5 or 6 kind of main things that I see as it relates to this criminal on the cross who came to saving faith and express that faith in Jesus. First off, we see that he recognizes that sin is his problem much more than death is his problem. His own sinfulness is a greater issue than his impending death minutes or hours from now. And it's not the initial judgment, right? It's not the fact that he's nailed on this cross, losing his life. What he sees as the bigger issue is the second death that's going to come. It's the separation, not just from this earth, but it's the separation from God that ultimately grabs his attention and grabs a hold of his heart. And that's something you and I have to wrestle with too. The second thing is that he recognizes that he deserves judgment and not mercy. He deserves judgment and not mercy. As he calls to Jesus, he doesn't say of Jesus to remember all the good that he did. There wasn't much good anyway, based on this account. He didn't ask Jesus to remember how he helped anybody or what his best intentions were, how he gave or so forth. He doesn't ask any of that. He knows his own evil is enough for the judgment that he's receiving right now. It wasn't mercy that he was owed. It was judgment. It wasn't mercy that the Romans gave him. It was judgment. And yet it's not judgment that he wants. It's the mercy of God. And so he recognizes that he deserves the judgment and not mercy, but he reaches out to Jesus anyway. Why does he do that? It's because the third thing, he believes that Jesus is the king. Now, he had that sign above the cross, this is the King of the Jews. But I think even more importantly is he asked Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. And I think he recognizes that in Jesus there is something divine because this man has done nothing wrong. He said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He recognizes Jesus' authority not just as King of the Jews, but as we said earlier, he recognizes him as the King of the universe. I think also he believes in his heart of hearts that death will not stop Jesus, right? So think of this. He's literally hanging on the cross, nailed to it. He's not going anywhere. He's literally dying right next to Jesus. And Jesus would come to die first, as we know in the story. And yet he has complete confidence in Jesus, that the death of Jesus is not the end of Jesus. But the death of Jesus is also not the end for this man, because he believes that death is not the end. Because what did he ask of Jesus? To remember him when he gets to his kingdom. And so death is not the end. The other thing is he believes Jesus will be merciful to those who ask of him. He believed in asking that he would be remembered. He asked of Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And I think that's a really humble way of asking Jesus to forgive him. You know, all he's asking is that he keep him in his memory. He didn't necessarily say, Lord, forgive me. He didn't necessarily say, all those repentant prayers, I receive you into my heart and all these kinds of things. He just simply said, please remember me. And Jesus gives him the assurance that today he would be with him in paradise. What comforting words to a dying man. Now, if we were to turn quickly to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7 through 9, this is talking about the judgment of Christ. And it reads this, and to grant relief to you who are afflicted as well to us, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels, in flaming fire, inflicting vengeance on those who do not know God and on those who do not obey the gospel of the Lord Jesus. They will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. What he's talking about here is that those who do not know Jesus, such as the first criminal who reviled him, who showed no humility, who continued to reject Jesus. This is the ultimate end that they're coming to. But for the second criminal, he believes Jesus is going to be merciful to him. You know, the second thief, he received the promise of Jesus. Today you'll be with me in paradise. What will this dying man ever accomplish for Jesus? Nothing. He's not going to accomplish anything for Jesus. He's literally dying on this cross. He's got nothing left to give. So on what basis is this man given access to heaven, to join Jesus in paradise? It's only on the basis of belief. That's it. On true, humble faith. There's nothing this man can do. And so it's really all about, this story is the perspective of faith. And it's almost like a mirror image of something Jesus talked about in passages before this, was his talks about the sheep and the goats and how there will be a sifting. There will be, a left and the right, that, those will be entered into heaven and the others will be put into the fire. And the same is happening here at the cross. You have one thief on the left and one on the right. One showed humble faith. The other showed arrogance and pride, a lack of humility. And it's just a very telling picture as you look at Jesus and these two thieves, because that's all of us. The question for us is going to continue to always be, which side of Jesus will you find yourself on? Will you find yourself on the side of arrogance and pride, or will you find yourself on the side of humility and faith? And that's something that we have to wrestle with. That's something that these criminals wrestled with as we consider the perspectives of the passion. And so here's the final questions for you is, faith is not primarily about doing any one thing. Faith is about owning all that Christ has already done for you. And that's exactly what that thief on the cross did. There was nothing he could give back to Jesus at this point. Nothing he could do. He couldn't go on a mission trip or serve or give money or any of this stuff. He couldn't do anything. All he could do is die. But he died in faith. So the question is, do you revile Jesus, or have you humbly accepted all that he is and all that he has done for you? And if so, will you take the opportunity that you do have with the remainder of your days to serve him? Jesus indeed is the friend of sinners. Don't you know him? And if you don't, won't you know him? I pray this has been helpful for you as you consider the different perspectives. What's your perspective of Jesus? I pray that it's one of humility. I pray that it's one of acceptance, of one of deep faith, to accept all that he has already done for you, and to humbly receive it and joyfully live out that faith all of your days. Take care and God bless.